Um, as Phil said, the Code for Sports Governance has been undergoing a review. The original version, I agree, has had a pretty transformative effect on the sector, and both Sport England and UK Sport are keen to ensure that it remains ahead of the game and keeps serving the sector in helping it to improve its governance. I know many of you took part in the recent consultation exercise, and no doubt many of you are eager to know what the finished product holds in store. So I'm delighted to have Lynsey Tweddle, Head of Corporate Governance at Sport England, and Rob Morini, Head of Governance and International Relations at UK Sport, to give us an update on the consultation process, an idea of what's been learned, and perhaps a little look ahead to see what the road ahead might look like in terms of version 2 of the code. Welcome, Rob and Lynsey.
Thank you, Craig. And I think Craig's going to help us with the slides. So thanks very much for that, Craig. Rob and I are delighted to have the opportunity to speak today. So thank you to the Sports Governance Academy for inviting us. And it's great to see in the chat the range of organisations listening in. So hello to everybody there. We had hoped to speak about the outcomes of the code review today, but we're still currently working with government just to confirm some of the final recommendations and hope to be able to announce those shortly. So sorry we can't sort of speak in detail about the outcomes today, but we thought what we would cover is, and hopefully, I'm not sure if you can see the slides yet, but hopefully you can. What we thought we would cover is, firstly, I'll sort of give a bit of background about the code. Thank you, Craig. Give a bit of background about the code for those who are less familiar with it, including a bit about the implementation of it the first time round and the impact it's had. And then Rob's going to give some reflections on the impact and what our experience has shown us over the last few years. I'll talk a bit about the approach we've taken to the review and the scope. Next slide, please, Craig. I'll talk a bit about the approach we've taken to the review and the scope, and then Rob will sort of talk a bit about what we've learnt based on the consultation and views we gathered as part of that, and then Rob will move on to what's come next and the direction of travel. So just to give you a bit of an outline of the sorts of things we're going to cover today. Then at the end, we're hoping to have some time for questions. And if we see some questions coming up in the chat at the side and we spot something along the way, we'll try and answer those as well. So next slide, please, Craig. Thank you. So the code was, the genesis of the code was a government sports strategy, Sporting Future, they published back in December 2015, where they set an action for Sport England and UK Sport to essentially develop a code for sports governance. And we worked on that for the best part of sort of nine months. It was quite a short timeline to produce it, but we launched that with an event for partners in October 2016, and then it went live essentially for investments from the investment period from April 2017. And in the sports strategy, the government essentially set an ambition for the code to set a gold standard in governance. So against a backdrop at the time of some international scandals in sport governance, IAAF and FIFA, they wanted England and the UK bodies to be leading the way in terms of sports governance. And it wasn't that our sector was in a particularly poor position, but they wanted us to be world leading. So there's that ambition for setting the high standard from the start. And it's a mandatory code. So essentially it's investment conditions. So any bodies seeking funding from Sport England or UK Sport must comply with the code. So it provides quite a firm lever in that sense for change, and at the time it did. And there's a range of partners that we both invest in, and Sport England in particular has such a cross section of partners it works with. It was really important for the code, given that it was a mandatory condition, to be proportionate and to be applied in all those different settings. So for that reason, it's got 3 tiers that allows different tiers to be applied at different levels of investment, or depending on the nature of the relationship with the partner, the body that we're investing in. So tier 1 currently, in the sort of current code, has 7 minimum governance standards, and tier 3, which is the highest level of the code, has 58, which sounds a lot, but it's codifying a lot of things that are standard normal practice that organisations are already doing. And so over the last 4 years, I think it says 3,000 there, and on a recent check, I think it's probably just over 4,000 organisations have now been assessed against the code as compliant with it, or have put in actions in place to become compliant. Now, a lot of those are at the lower level, the tier 1 range of the code. That's where you get into the thousands, because Sport England's making a lot of investments at that level. But you can see the impact that's having across the sector. But there are still 300 partners at the top 2 tiers of the code being assessed and working towards compliance with the code. And that's just under 20% of those are national governing bodies of sport. So there's often a perception the code only relates to national governing bodies, but it's had a much broader impact than that. So now just under 20% are NGBs. About 16% are active partnerships, so local sport partnerships, and the rest are strategic partners, such as some of which I'm sure will be listening in today, such as Women in Sports, the Youth Sport Trust, Street Games, Chance to Shine, Sporting Equals, Simpsfair, that Phil spoke about, and UK Coaching. Now, I won't name check everybody, but I'm sure there'll be a few here today. But you can see that the scope that the code's had and the impact that it's had. And those partners and the people we work with in the sector have engaged so positively with it. There were challenges, of course, at the start. It was a new code, it's a mandatory investment, it's involved some significant changes, but partners in the sector have engaged so positively with it, and we're really grateful for that. Next slide, please, Craig. So just to give you a bit of information about, what impact has the code had when it's been implemented over the last 4 years. And this by no means covers everything. This just gives a bit of a flavour around some examples of some of the changes and some of the support areas we've worked in. So there's been reforms to board membership, and that includes things like increased independence on boards and greater diversity around the board table. There's also been improved transparency, so more information published about how organisations run, the decisions they make, the documents that govern them. So often you'll look on websites now and you'll be able to access, the documents, their articles of association or their strategy frameworks. And also organisations, many more are publishing minutes or key outcomes of board discussions. So it's more transparent for those people, for members of the organisation, for those people involved in that organisation, playing that sport or doing that physical activity. And then the introduction of maximum term limits has also meant there's been a renewal, a refresh of ideas around that board table, as well as creating more opportunities, more vacancies, more opportunities for people to get involved in sports governance. Now, underpinning that was a huge amount of work from bodies in the sector who are funded from UK Sport and Sport England to make those changes, working really hard with their partners, with their members, to agree those and drive those through to strengthen governance within their organisations. So it absolutely is an effort across the sector. So part of that, alongside that sort of the changes that organisations have needed to implement, we've tried to put in place some support initiatives to help organisations. And I should say there's been a shift as well. I think at the start, when the code was first introduced, it was naturally quite a compliance heavy process. It felt like that because there was a big period of assessment and organisations had to make some significant changes at the time. But all through that, despite the sort of feeling of being compliance heavy, we've been keen to make sure that alongside that we are supporting organisations and working with them to make those changes. And here's just an example of a few of the initiatives that have been put in place. So the Sports Governance Academy, of course, that Phil spoke in a bit more detail about. And he also mentioned the Parrot-Laver partnership, which has developed a network of senior experienced candidates from a range of backgrounds to help develop greater board diversity in the sector. We've had knowledge exchanges, so facilitated sessions with partners on areas such as the role of the senior independent director. Over the last year, we've put in place some specific COVID support. So we have an assurance partner in BDO that would normally conduct assurance reviews. We changed for the last year the support they provided, and they developed a web hub and a helpline for partners to provide support on COVID specific issues around financial management or anything related to how organisations were running. And alongside that, from a COVID point of view, we also opened up some access to the legal advice through the legal panel framework and have funded that for some partners. And then there are specific project support, so individual awards to organisations for governance improvement projects, and that's covered a variety of different things such as board evaluations, strategic reviews, regional governance reviews, so reviews of governance within regions, perhaps within a governing body, HR support and financial advice. So a huge amount of different support initiatives, and that's absolutely one of the areas that we'll be developing further over the next year as we come to announce the outcomes of the code review. So I'll hand over to Rob, and I think it would be next slide, please, Craig. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynsey, and thanks to the SGA for inviting us to speak. It's really great to be speaking to so many of you this morning. So briefly, just an opportunity to share some reflections, I guess, from our perspective, both from UK Sport and Sport England's effectively governance teams that have really done a lot of the work in terms of rolling out the code and working with you. I mean, Lynsey alluded to this before, there is no question that when the code came out, it really felt as a top-down instrument being mandated and effectively imposed on the sector for all the reasons that Lynsey outlined before in terms of strategic rationale for the code to be in place in the first place. But I think fairly quickly there's been really strong engagement and collaboration from yourselves and from many of our funded partners. And actually there was a risk that the code could be seen as a tick box exercise, as something to comply with. And of course, the very nature of it, that an element of that undoubtedly was there and is still there. But I think the way the sector responded and funded partners responded enabled a much more, a much deeper and meaningful conversation with partners in terms of how the code could assist effectively the governance of the organisation. And I think what we've seen over time as well, that whilst this was kind of rolled out onto funded partners, as new partners came on board, new organisations that have been seeking UK Sport and Sport England investment, really our own engagement with them has also evolved and changed, perhaps one of around really being able to explain the code and actually making sure that it's applicable to the needs of the organisation, and organisations see how it can assist. So it's something that I think we've witnessed a bit of an evolution in terms of how the code is then applied and used by partners. Inevitably, I mean, it's been almost it's been 4 years that it's been in place. We've had feedback from you and from the range of other partners in terms of what's worked, what's not worked. The code has been new to everyone, including ourselves, and actually the areas where more support is really required, and that's something that we can touch on later, because I think that's something that we picked up as part of the review. But I think the key point here that we absolutely want that feedback to continue, because it's critical in order to be able to work together and address some of the issues and challenges that I think Phil outlined at the start. It is a standard framework. It is divided into these 3 tiers. And some of the challenges sometimes is really to be able to ensure that the framework applies consistently and across the board, even though we've got these kind of different chunks of organizations belonging to different tiers. But ultimately, we have to recognize that no one size fits all, and therefore we've had to be pragmatic and flexible in the way we've applied the code. But also critically, we've got to be consistent. And I think that's where that tier 2 and tier 3, where we've got, like Lynsey said, about 300 organizations in those tiers, we've been able to apply particularly in the tier 2 area, sort of a mix of measures to ensure that it responded to organisations in terms of their size and the size of the investment, and ultimately what was required of them. Inevitably, sort of, we've been working very closely together as sports councils, and I would argue that perhaps that this is an area in which the two sports councils, UK Sport and Sport England, have been working probably the closest on across sort of, the different areas of work that we do engage in. Inevitably, sort of, there's always ways in which we can sort of, look at working even better together, not just between ourselves, but also with yourselves. And again, that's been a running thread in terms of the review of the code as we started to kind of look at any changes that we might want to put in place. And Lynsey already touched on this in terms of the tangible impact on structures, particularly in terms of decision making. Other areas that we've seen, quite interestingly, is I think the code has allowed sort of, organisations to really get on with policies and procedures that perhaps were there in the making for some time, but actually sort of it's kind of encouraged organisations to get them done in some respects and actually see the benefit of really getting those finalised. And we've seen those playing their part in terms of really creating organisations that do have those policies and procedures in place and are able to kind of ensure that level of accountability and transparency. And ultimately, as I said, sort of, the level of support that the partners have requested from us is something that I think we've also seen a lot of the fruits of. Ultimately, is an instrument of good governance. It is a set of requirements, but governance is obviously goes beyond that. Governance is about obviously the way we make decisions, the culture around boards, the cultures within the organisation, and how decisions are made. And therefore, it's really important that those factors are also weaved into as we started to review the impact and where we want to go next with the code. Next slide, Craig, please. Perhaps just to take a bit of a left turn here, because this is one of the areas that I also oversee. Sort of is sort of UK Sport investment in international relations. We fund a number of NGBs that sort of effectively then are active in international sport, particularly within their international federations, their well-governing bodies of which they're members, to ensure that the UK has got a stronger, respected and influential voice in shaping decisions and shaping also the governance of international sport. Now, Lynsey touched on this earlier. Sort of, the code came in sort of at a time when there were some big issues in international sport. All of you will remember sort of, the scandals impacting FIFA. And there was a desire from government to sort of ensure that the UK and England sort of, were seen as sort of, as sort of showcasing really high standards of governance, and that could be also conveyed internationally. Since producing the code and rolling out the code, I mean, especially those first few years, we've had a number of countries expressing a lot of interest in the very nature of the code and sort of, and actually the sort of, the product itself in terms of what it consists of and the content of it. We've had countries such as Poland and Japan and Australia that have emulated the code since. They've come up with their own codes, obviously quite different in some respects. For example, Japan looks at sport integrity more broadly. Poland has a similar sort of framework as ours, but it's been quite interesting also from countries such as New Zealand, France and Italy and Germany and Canada and so on, that really have taken an interest in how we've devised the code and the very principle of safeguarding public investment and actually putting in place these kind of mandatory measures. But it's also caused a bit of a stir. I think in relation to the principle of autonomy of sport, that clearly sports are very attached to, and it's really important to this principle of actually government and funding councils effectively sort of mandating requirements onto them. And the way we've explained to them is that effectively sort of we absolutely respect the principle of autonomy of sport. That's integral to sport, but ultimately we have a responsibility for safeguarding public investment, and therefore if organizations want to access that funding, it seems right and proper that these standards are in place. And the other thing is really about the sort of the introduction of a mandatory requirement around independence, at least 25% for those tier 3 organisations. almost running against sort of, the principle of democracy. And that's been quite interesting to witness, sort of, amongst perhaps I'd argue some of the supposedly some of the more progressive nations, for example, sort of, Scandinavian countries, really objecting to the point of actually sort of, sport is for sport. And therefore, sort of, when you look at the skills and when you look at the people that sort of, populate the boards and the decision-making bodies of sport, it should come from within sport rather than seeking sort of skills and independence and people from the outside. Because ultimately having people that don't understand sport, and that's actually been quite an interesting dialogue and dichotomy that we've had to explain. And actually sort of, this is really recognizing that sort of, the skills that are required in any business, and that includes sport, and sport ultimately is a business, that sort of, and sort of really making sure that governing bodies have that balance of skills and individuals from within and also from the outside. As I said, sort of, NGBs are quite active in shaping international sports governance. We need to be really careful and really sensitive that this is not about the UK sort of, showing the rest of the world how governance is done. Is absolutely not the case. And in fact, it's not about sort of, promoting the code as such, but actually sort of, what we've seen is NGBs drawing on sort of, some of the provisions in the code to kind of then try and generate reform, particularly around term limits in international sports bodies. And you'd be surprised, quite a number of them had none. So you had presidents and people on those decision-making bodies over more than 3 decades. The final thing I would say here is sort of, that we've been able to establish an international partnership against corruption in sport, which really looks at promoting sort of a number of measures to ensure that the risks of corruption are reduced in global sport. And that is a partnership that involves the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, the International Paralympic Committee, and several international federations, of which many of you are members, but also other governments as well. And there is absolutely no question that the code has been seen as an instrument, as a framework to really refer to, not just in terms of the provisions, but I think also the way it's outlined with sort of, with the requirements and the commentaries and the narrative that wraps around sort of, effectively governance in sport in England and across UK bodies. So, and it's interesting from an international perspective, is looking at it through the lens of corruption. We don't quite have the sort of, we're not looking, it's not the same lens we're doing it here in the UK, but nonetheless it is actually the sort of, the role that good governance has in tackling sort of, some of the issues that we certainly find in international sport. Pass on back to Lynsey. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. So that's given you, I guess, sort of a background to the code as it existed, the initial code that was developed, and the implementation of that and some of the impact that it's had. So moving on to the review of the code 4 years on, I guess we've just included a couple of quotes here to sort of indicate or illustrate how the review came about. We already had been thinking about doing the review, but probably had it penned in for this year rather than last year, I'd say. But and next slide, please, Craig. There's a quote there from the minister sort of initiating the review, and then this quote sort of outlines sort of Sport England and UK sport views as we initiated the review itself. So as I said, we've been looking at doing the review of the code anyway 4 years on, but accelerated that against a backdrop of Black Lives Matter and a particular focus on diversity and inclusion. It seemed right to accelerate that review process and commence it last year rather than this year. And you can see here in the quotes there the importance of diversity and inclusion in terms of the review. Next slide, please, Craig. So I'll just talk a little bit about the scope of the review and the approach we've taken. So as I've mentioned and just sort of introduced there, we've taken a particular focus on diversity and inclusion with the review, but we have taken the opportunity as well to do a general review of all aspects of the code. So whilst it's had that targeted focus, that hasn't been the only element of it. Having said that, we've looking at diversity and inclusion, that hasn't just meant we've looked at those specific diversity requirements in the code. We've taken that lens across everything in the code. So the work stream that was looking at diversity and inclusion has looked not only at the sort of 3 specific requirements that currently exist in the code around that, they've looked at every single requirement and every aspect of the code. And of course, it's made sense in doing the review to review best practice developments over the last 4 years to make sure that the revised code is current. Well, not only current, but future-proofed as well. So we've looked ahead to what else is on the horizon, what else is being talked about in the world of governance. And then we've also thought about what other new areas might be included in the code. So that there's always a bucket list of things that get put together in terms of things people, or not just us, but other people want to put in the code, because it's been quite an effective lever for change in a number of areas, and it's a mandatory condition of investment. It's quite useful for some people thinking, oh, if we put that in the code, we can get that done. So there's always been a bucket list building up. We've taken a really hard look at that this time with the review to consider on that sort of shopping list of things, is the code the right tool for those things, or are there other better mechanisms in place to deliver those? So you can see quite a rounded review, but with that particular focus on diversity and inclusion elements. So given that scope and the terms of reference, just a bit about our approach to the project itself. You won't be surprised that I've sort of noted there, or we've noted, diverse and inclusive project management was really important to us. So we didn't just want to talk about diversity and inclusion in terms of the code and delivery. We wanted to make sure that that was embedded throughout the project. And there's a number of ways we've tried to do that. So colleagues, we haven't just sort of formed a project group with colleagues from the governance teams in both organisations. We've looked across both organisations and drawn on experience and expertise and knowledge and skills, and that includes our internal staff networks who are looking at areas such as ethnic diversity, disability, and really drawn on their skills. And then as part of that, we also felt it was important to bring some external objective perspective into the project. So our project board had 3 independent members on it, and a couple of them, I think, at least are here today. So Pippa Britton, who amongst other things is Vice Chair of Sport Wales, and very experienced in the area of governance. We had Nigel Boatswain, who was Director at Apple and is on the Dame Kelly Holmes Trust and was part of the Perrott Labour Partnership. And then Craig, who's been speaking already, who was able to bring his experience from the Chartered Governance Institute. And we were incredibly lucky to have, feel really fortunate to have those 3 independent members on the project board who brought such valuable contributions to the project. And I think really the whole project recognised the importance of their input. And then it was really important for us also to make sure that the work that we developed was evidence-based, and there are a number of ways in which that was achieved. So I'm sure a number of you on this call will have contributed as board members to the diversity audit. So that's an audit looking at the composition of boards across the sector and trying to get a sense of how diverse they are. That's building on previous audits that have, call them audits if you like, but surveys that have taken place of that women in boards have conducted, looking at the gender diversity on boards, ethnic diversity and disability as well. So we wanted to make sure that we had the latest position on that. And then we've also done other work such as comparative analysis with other sectors. And then, of course, we wanted to hear the views from the sector, and undertook a consultation which was managed independently. And that took the form of an online survey and 10 focus groups. And Thank you so much to those of you who contributed to that. Rob will give a flavour of some of the things we've learned coming out of the consultation. And then as a joint project, it's been really important for us to act as one team, and it's really felt like that at all levels of the project. So not just within the project team itself, but our CEOs are very aligned on this. Every level across both organisations has worked really closely on the code, and you'll hopefully see that Rob and I are presenting together today, hopefully seamlessly. But it's really felt like a one team effort, and we're keen to make sure that continues, as we have tried to ensure over the last 4 years. And lastly, important to seek legal advice where it's been needed to test and check any elements or changes we are proposing that might have had a legal angle. So hopefully that gives you a sense of how the review was approached and what it looked at. And Rob will tell you a bit more now about what we learned through the review process. Thanks, Rob. Next slide, please, Craig. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynsey. So, you heard Lynsey talking about sort of the consultation. We've had more than 200 responses to this, and from the online survey, as well as sort of focus groups that took a deeper dive in some of the kind of areas that Lynsey outlined that sort of were part of the scope of the review. And we took that opportunity to kind of test the impact of the code. And actually, we've been really heartened by sort of, by responses saying that the vast majority of organizations have indicated that the code has been a really effective and helpful tool for their organizations, and that has had a real impact. So that's obviously been a real positive. At the same time, sort of, and again, sort of, it's just looking back at sort of what we were mentioning before, particularly those first 6 to 12 months in terms of when the code was rolled out. There is no question that some organisations felt the pain and actually experienced real resistance from within and real challenge, particularly where they had to reform their structures, their decision-making structures. Hopefully, sort of, now the dust has settled, and actually, sort of, what we are seeing is more of a shift around sort of, supporting and working with partners to really ensure that those changes are being embedded, and we are supporting you throughout. The two main areas of impact, interestingly, have been sort of, the tightening of the organisation's governance overall. I mentioned earlier, one of the things that as teams we witness is policies and procedures that sort of, organisations really sort of, just got on with in terms of sort of, kind of making sure they were finalised, but also actually how governance is not something that sort of, was just affecting the board, but actually how that's cascaded across the organisation and indeed the member bodies of a particular sport. But sort of Lynsey has already outlined sort of, the equality and diversity on the board. So the fact that we introduced a gender target of at least 30% of either gender sort of on boards, sort of, has really obviously has changed the makeup on the boards. But I think more fundamentally, sort of, the diversity of thought on the boards and actually the quality of the discussions that sort of, have taken place on the boards. That's certainly something that we've been hearing loud and clear through the survey and indeed through our own experience of working with partners. As I said before, sort of, the changes in many cases have not just been limited to the boards, but actually started filtering down into the organisation's culture. Particularly around areas of sort of accountability and transparency, and indeed also on diversity. But there are areas inevitably of improvement. And sort of, the code is seen as quite accessible in terms of language, but I think there are areas where it could be simplified, particularly for those tier 1 organisations that might be new to this and to governance more broadly. So are there sort of, is to making sure that sort of, we kind of we use much more plain English and really explain concepts in a simpler way. But also, actually, the code at the moment is quite a it's a PDF document and involves sort of, quite a sort of information across all of the 3 tiers. Is there an opportunity for developing interactive guidances and examples from the sector that individual organizations could draw on and actually ensure that they can access the information that is really more readily available and relevant to them. And also the principle of proportionality. Ultimately, the code is, as you've heard, is structured in line, tiers of investment. But there is a question that you could be receiving very high amounts and therefore be in the tier 3 category, but be quite a small organization, and therefore internal capacity for handling the different requirements of the code could be quite limited, and therefore just, I suppose, making clear to both UK Sport and Sport England some of the pressures that sometimes this organizations experience in terms of implementing the code as well. Next slide, Craig. Lynsey touched on this already. ED&I is was the substantive focus, has been the substantive focus of the review, and is an area that I through the survey we've also been encouraged that actually many organisations felt that this is something that they welcome as part of the review, but alongside that also making very clear that any changes or any additional measures around ED&I should really be strongly supported by UK Sport and Sport England. Actually, organisations in the sector as a whole really looking for guidance and for both central support, i.e. from within, from our own organisations, as well as specialist support, particularly in the area of recruitment, where many organisations struggle to look outside of the pool that is really known to them for board members, and indeed many recruit from their membership bodies, apart from obviously independent non-executive directors, and for that you've had references to the Parrot Labour project. I won't go into detail because there's a session on that later on, but that's something that we've certainly heard many organisations welcoming that type of support and increase support in that area. Next slide, Craig, please. Other areas, that came from the survey and from the focus groups, really suggestions of including areas such as environmental sustainability, and this is really looking at and also what's happening in the medium to long term, and what is it that and other organizations to which the code applies really should be thinking about more proactively about safeguarding, and perhaps that won't come too much as a surprise given the whole we've all been facing. And also, as I said, the cascading from board to other parts of the organisation is something that we've been hearing quite loud and clear. I think a very strong point has been made around board culture, that this is recognising the importance of the fundamental, paramount importance of actually the culture that exists within the board, and actually the role of the chair and obviously all other board directors in ensuring that a positive, inclusive and constructive culture is built around the table, and again that's from the top of your across the board, and that's something that we've taken quite in the last couple of years and initiated a project. We put it on hold in view of COVID, but actually something that's not least through the feedback is something that we're actively interested to pick up again and really engage with you on as we go forward and roll out the code. And finally, the importance of transparency, something that absolutely the feedback revealed. This is something that organisations are really and actually continuing to share information in the public domain. The final point is we are recognise that we are in a very privileged position at UK Sport and Sport England, because in many ways we've got this kind of helicopter view in terms of what's happening across nations, and actually a message in specific, from across the sector or specific groups of organizations, and drawing examples of best practice or where things even have gone wrong, so that actually sort of, funded partners can learn from that. And I think, again, this is something the SGA will already assist on and will be able to assist on in the future, I have no doubt. I think the final couple of slides you'll be pleased to know. Next slide, please, Craig. It's really sort of, so what next? And we have completed the review, as Lynsey said. We're just talking to government about some of those recommendations, but we expect sort of, to announce shortly sort of the changes in the code. And as I said, sort of, you won't be surprised, given what we've heard from funded partners, is that we are sort of really very carefully looking at the nature and you heard Phil mention about Sport England strategy and sort of governance, good governance being one of the catalysts in that strategy. UK Sport is due to announce our own strategy sort of in the coming few weeks to partners and to the media. So you'll find out, you'll hear more about that soon. But I think perhaps one thing that I wanted to mention is that from our perspective, the work on governance remains critical, but also as part of a wider lens that we're going to be applying on organizations in terms of the wider corporate health, which includes governance, but also expands in other areas of finance and strategy and leadership and connectivity across the system. So this is something that we're already working with our own funded partners, and something that we'll be expanding on into over the course of the next few years. I think one thread that sort of is going to run through not only sort of the revised code, but actually the way we can see the next steps in governance is a phrase that Lynsey has used and I really loved, in terms of shifting from mandated governance to actually governance that is owned by the sector. And I think something, again, it just repositions the way not only the code, but also UK Sport and Sport England found themselves in relation to the code. And actually this not being a top-down instrument that obviously will be there to safeguard sort of public investment, but we are there to kind of work with you to kind of implement and see how we can take governance to the next level. But also recognise, as Phil's mentioned earlier, that we are in a very disrupted, very new, very difficult, very challenging environment, and therefore we also need to recognise that actually that the sort of the way that the code is presented and sort of what it's there for needs to recognise that the challenges of the sector, and therefore those three elements of diversity, growth, and resilience, I think is something that speaks to the way we want to approach our governance work going forward. The final slide is just a couple of images, and I think it just tries to depict and remind ourselves what this is all for. And it is about sort of sport and physical activity. And some actually was Pippa Britton that was on our project board. Sort of the way she described the governance is that thread, right, that brings that little child sort of on that boat and runs through sort of the volunteers and the coaches and the workforce and the leaders, and then all the way up to board, and indeed the success that often we enjoy in high performance sport is that thread that brings it and links it all together. And I think sort of it's really important and great to be looking at governance through that lens, rather than seeing it as fairly dry sort of kind of thing that sort of organizations need to comply with and tick that box. It's part of sort of the everyday fabric of what we love most. I think that's it. So I hope that was useful, and look forward to talking and questions next.
Rob, as you were talking there, I could see I was trying to pick up some questions in the side. So I'll maybe sort of try and scroll back to the first one I could see from Mark Lucas, Director of Strategy and Performance at Work. So talked about, can you explain a little more with I think it means what the 30% target is. So just to explain, that's in the current code, and that's one of the requirements where we ask organisations to set a target for at least 30% gender representation on their boards. So making sure there are at least 30% of men and women at the time when we were doing the code. That's how it was sort of couched, because some organisations were their boards were predominantly male, and we do have some that were predominantly female. So it was making sure that the organisations set a target themselves of at least 30% representation. Esther Jones, Diversity and Inclusion Manager at UK Coaching, asked, are the review findings going to be published? So we will publish the outcome of the review. We haven't sort of intended to publish the consultation findings, not for any reason. If we find that that's useful, we could review that, but more that was a piece of information that informed, one piece of information that formed the review, but some of the findings from the consultation will form part of the announcement about the outcome of the review. So we'll hopefully pick out the salient points. Rob, I'll carry on going, but I'm conscious I'm answering them. So if there's any that you want to pick up as we go along, so Ruth has asked, are you ensuring, Ruth Holdaway, I think from Women's Spot, are you ensuring all organisations meet the gender target? I.e., are you now refusing to fund organisations that don't achieve the target? Organisations have had a long time to achieve this. And it's a question that comes up, given that it's a mandatory code. We often get asked about penalties and what's the penalty of not meeting the code, either in this area or any other area. Ultimately, there is as a mandatory condition of funding, there is a sanction of funding if we want to, if we find that that's needed, but that's absolutely not our starting point. So we want to drive change. We want to work with organisations to achieve those changes. So our starting point would be to have a conversation with partner to understand what they're finding difficult in that area, why that isn't happening. And I think what we're really looking for is meaningful, tangible progress. And a willingness to do that. I think conversations get harder where there's not that willingness and drive to make those changes. Rob, this might be one that, given the UK sport remit, what Laddie from Leisure and Physical Activity Development Manager at Hackney Council has asked what the buy-in is from the other home countries outside of England to the code.
Yeah, great question. We are in regular dialogue with our counterparts in the other home country sports councils, and so there's been open sharing about the code, and also hearing and learning from the frameworks that they've got in place. There's no, it isn't buying as such, but I think it's more about actually really learning and understanding the different frameworks that are in place. Where we are seeing, and I think this is running both within UK Sport certainly, and I'm sure at Sport England as well, a real desire to share more with our counterparts across the sports councils, not just in governance terms, but also actually more broadly in terms of the sporting system as a whole, and how we work more collaboratively, across the board to help organisations, really address some of the challenges, some of which might be in governance and in other areas as well, particularly off the back of obviously the year that we've had. So I expect, if anything, this area to increase going forward. So yeah.
Thanks, Rob. I see a couple of questions there. So from Lucy McClements at British Handball and Beatrice McGlenn at the Croquet Association asking, I think about support there and currently unfunded organisations. So one of the things I would like to say is that Phil mentioned before our strategy Uniting the Movement and the Good Governance Catalyst within that. And one of the focus areas we have is to focus governance support on organisations. It's a passion of mine to focus some of our support on organisations we don't currently fund, because traditionally, because of the connections we have, our support and the support offerings have been directed really at funded bodies. But I'm really keen that we develop our support programme much broader than that. So we'll be looking particularly to try and make sure there's access for organisations that aren't currently funded through the traditional route from UK Sport or Sport England. So hopefully we'll be developing plans over the next year in that area. Simon at Living Sport. Go on, Rob. Sorry.
No, go ahead. I think I'm a little bit sort of ahead in terms of some of the questions that I can see as well.
So Simon at Living Sport has asked about, so many of us are charities and companies, how does the code relate to their guidance? Has there been a check review against their standards to see if there are pulls in different directions? And is there, or should there be primacy of any one of these? So yeah, absolutely. There are a number of different codes out there, and Sport England in particular has connections with so many different types of bodies. So we have quite a bit of experience over the last 4 years of funding bodies that are, well, many charities or who, to whom different codes apply. And I think that the code has proved itself adaptable in that respect, so that there shouldn't be anything contradictory in there, and we're able to adapt and interpret the requirements in a way where if you're already doing things, then we would just take that as part of the assessment. And the code isn't law either, I should say that. So it's a funding condition, but of course, if there are aspects of law, either through charity or company law, that you need to meet, then that would absolutely take precedence. But the code, as I said, shouldn't cut across those in any way. It should be able to align with those, as we've sort of tested it quite thoroughly over the last 4 years.
Sorry, Lynsey, just on Simon's point there, it's probably worth saying that certainly the Charity Governance Code does state quite explicitly that it recognises that some organisations cross sort of sectoral boundaries, and if there's a code in a particular sector that you can or should adhere to, then do that. And I think it mentions by name this code that if you're a sporting charity, then perhaps you might want to sort of give primacy, as Simon phrases it, to the sports code. So it recognises that there's not the potential for conflict, but there's the potential for overlap in terms of sort of regulatory oversight, for want of a better word. So I think it would suggest that if you're a sport, use the sports one.
Thanks, Craig. Sorry, go on, Rob, did you pick up some questions there?
Yeah, there's a question there around from Pamela Woodman from the LTA, sort of in terms of anticipated timescales for setting out the details of the changes and the publication of the new code. Hopefully soon. We do sort of anticipate this to be able to announce the changes hopefully in May. As I said, we're just talking to government counterparts to make sure that they are briefed and they're aware of the recommended changes. And in terms of and that will sort of, what we expect in the announcement is to share what those changes are and what the requirements are. But in terms of the publication of the new code itself, that will take probably a couple of months for us to produce the revised version of the code itself. What we focused on is around actually the changes to the requirements and the commentary that currently are there. So as I said, we hope to put an announcement out shortly and then publish the code in a couple of months' time. And then in terms of sort of organisations then having to comply with any new requirements, set out timescales that absolutely takes into account what the changes are and and allow for that time to take place. Apologies if it sounds a little bit woolly, but I think you'll appreciate we're just waiting to that final checking internally before we provide all the detail. But the detail will be available when we're ready to announce.
Craig, I'm conscious of time. There are a few more questions there.
I think there are a couple of questions. I'm afraid we're not going to be able to get to them in this session. Perhaps it's something that we can pick up through other channels. But Sport England and UK Sport want the code to help organisations, and that I've really come to understand that that's the sort of driving motivation behind the code. So it's really exciting to see the consultation take place, and it will be really exciting to see exactly what those changes are in the next month or so. So Rob and Lynsey, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for that update. It's been really interesting, and I'm sure the people on the call will will have been really pleased to see how far we've come down the line in terms of this sort of evolution of the code, and we'll all look forward to seeing the finished product. So thank you both very much.
Thank you, Craig. And if there is a way we can pick up any of the other questions, either put them on the SGA forum or whatever, but very happy to do that. So not to lose them. Thanks very much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Lynsey.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Rob. Thank you both for your time.